Hello, folks. Tonight we're diving into the stomach of a legend, Alexander the Great, the guy who conquered half the world before turning 33, tamed wild horses as a teen, and founded cities like he was playing ancient SimCity, and yet still had to decide what to eat every single morning. Was it roasted lamb in a golden bowl, boiled lentils in a war tent, or just whatever didn't run away fast enough before we open his royal lunchbox? Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually dig this stuff, and drop a comment telling me where and when you're watching. I love knowing who's binge watching at 2 a.m. cereal straight from the box, like a true war general. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing white noise. And let's embark on tonight's journey. Before he was Alexander the Great, he was just Alexander time for some porridge. Long before the empire building, world conquering, and causing 3 continents to mourn. Young Alexander of Macedon started his day like any noble kid, with a breakfast so nutritious it was almost impossible to chew. Imagine a cold Macedonian morning. The sun hasn't even bothered to rise yet. Neither has Aristotle, but the kitchen's buzzing with the sound of barley boiling, and everyone pretending it tastes better today. Young Alex's breakfast probably included boiled barley, which is just a polite way to say salty hot mush. Sometimes they'd add a splash of goat's milk, or, if they were feeling festive, a dried fig that looked like it survived some tragic event. Next to this steaming bowl of desperate porridge, there'd be bread probably made from emmer or barley flour, rough in texture and about as soft as a brick. This is the kind of bread that screams political tension and simmering grudges. Olives would appear too, because nothing says kids' breakfast like bitter, oily fruit soaked in salty water. And if you were lucky, and by lucky I mean born into royalty, with at least one parent still breathing, you might get a chunk of goat cheese, matured enough to defend itself and clear your sinuses from across the room. Wine, yes, even for kids, but don't get too excited. It was watered down, nearly purplish stuff. Macedonians thought drinking straight wine was something only barbarians and hopelessly bad poets did. Sounds humble, and it was, but not because the Macedonian court was short on resources. No, Alexander's dad, Philip II, made sure to raise his son with a culture of restraint, no luxury, no fluff, just calories, protein, and the mindset of a man who'd one day eat Persian battlefield rations without blinking. So no golden pancakes, no eggs, Benedict just porridge, olives, and bread sturdy enough to prop up a collapsing column. Breakfast was the first win of the day. Imagine sitting down to lunch across from Aristotle, philosopher, scientist, and certified buzzkill when it comes to overeating. You just want to enjoy your barley bread and maybe a fig. And there he is, dropping TED Talk wisdom about moderation between bites of stewed lentils. As a teen, Alexander didn't just learn to swing a sword. He got lessons in ethics, logic, rhetoric, and maybe even in foods that make you too lazy to conquer Asia. Being Plato's student and a fan of balance in everything. Aristotle took it upon himself to make sure Alexander's body and mind got equal care, though probably not with a smile. Meals were character-building opportunities. Reach for that second piece of cheese. Aristotle might raise an eyebrow and casually remind you that gluttony hardens the soul and dulls the mind. Good times. But this wasn't just food shaming. Alongside this steaming bowl of desperate porridge, there'll be bread probably made from emmer or barley flour, with a rough texture and zero fluffiness. It's the kind of bread that looks back at you with bitterness and doubles as a political stress ball. Olives will also show up because nothing screams kids' breakfast like bitter, oily fruit soaked in brine. And if you're lucky, lucky meaning born into royalty with at least one parent still alive, you might get a slice of goat cheese, so aged it could defend itself, and clear your sinuses from across the room. Wine. Yep, even for kids. But don't get too excited. It's watered down, almost purple in color. Macedonians believed drinking straight wine was for barbarians and poets with terrible judgment. Sounds humble, and it kind of was, but not because the Macedonian court lacked resources. No, Alexander's dad, Philip II, purposely raised his son with a culture of restraint. No luxuries, no softness, just calories, protein, and the mental toughness of a guy who would one day eat a Persian field ration without blinking. So, no golden pancakes, no eggs. Benedict, just porridge, olives, and bread so dense it could hold up a collapsing pillar. Breakfast was the day's first victory. Now picture you're sitting down for lunch, staring at Aristotle, a philosopher, scientist, and the ultimate party pooper when it comes to overeating. You just want to enjoy your barley bread and maybe a figs. But he's there delivering a TED talk on moderation between bites of lentil stew. As a teen, Alexander didn't just learn sword swinging. He was schooled in ethics, logic, rhetoric, and probably even in foods that would make you too lazy to conquer Asia. A student of Plato and a fan of balance in everything. Aristotle took it upon himself to make sure Alexander's body and mind were equally nourished, though probably not too thrilled about it. Meals were chances to build character, grab a second piece of cheese, and Aristotle might just raise an eyebrow and casually drop that gluttony hardens the soul and dulls the intellect. Good times. But this wasn't just food shaming. Aristotle believed food was central in shaping leaders. Too little and you're weak. Too much and you become corrupt. Somewhere in the middle, you get an empire and a tight-knit inner circle. Alexander probably learned the difference between fuel food and vanity food in these lessons. Simple legumes like lentils were considered good for the soul, which is impressive given their taste, unless heavily seasoned. Meanwhile, anything too sweet, too spicy, or too fancy was suspicious, like it might rot your soul. Good for the soul, which is impressive considering these things taste pretty awful unless they're loaded with flavor. Meanwhile, anything too sweet, too spicy, or just plain fancy was suspicious, like it might rot your morals and have you lounging on velvet at sunset. It's kinda ironic when you think about food becoming a tool for teaching. Most kids learned the alphabet by carving letters into wax tablets, but Alexander, he was probably being quizzed on Hippocrates' thoughts about booze ratios and whether figs caused dirty thoughts. This diet philosophy stuck with him, even when Persian cuisine was considered top-notch. Lamb cooked in pomegranate sauce, rice so fragrant it should have been illegal. Alexander usually stuck to basics: bread, meat, water, maybe a few olives if things got desperate. So no, lunch with Aristotle wasn't a party, but it was formative. Alexander wasn't just learning to conquer cities. He was mastering the art of saying no to snacks, and in ancient Macedon, that was leadership. If you ever packed a lunch with love, hope, and exactly one stale piece of bread, congrats. You might just qualify as a professional Macedonian chef. Average lunch in ancient Macedon wasn't about flavor. It was about not passing out under the sun while yelling military slogans. Alexander's daily lunch, especially before campaigns, was so modest it made you tighten your belt and your jaw. We're talking a block of barley or some emma bread, baked so hard it might as well be ceramic tile. This is bread you had to earn the right to chew, preferably with a dagger and a prayer. Alongside this crunchy main event were a few local treasures. Goat cheese that traveled well, but smelled like it wanted to punch you in the face. And onions, basically Macedonia's version of a food group. They believed onions boosted strength and stamina, and apparently helped with diplomatic bad breath. You might also get a small pouch of figs or dried dates, depending on the season and whether the supply caravan had been eaten by wolves. These fruits were the ancient world's dessert sticky, chewy, somewhere between leather and regret. For protein, there might be salted or dried meat, usually goat or beef, sometimes boring if they'd just raided someone, not appetizing, not tender. It was the kind of meat that dared you to swallow and win. And if you were lucky, they'd have watered down wine. If not, it was lukewarm water from a leather bottle, soaked in sweat and saddle dust all day. Refreshing, technically. It's worth noting Alexander ate the same grub as his soldiers. No fancy spices or hand-peeled grapes. Nope. He sat on the ground, tore off a rock-hard piece of bread, and chewed like a man, trying to conquer an empire with jaw power alone. So when you think about the Macedonian lunchbox, don't picture a cute bento box. Picture a canvas sack packed with calories that hate you enough to keep you alive, working, and brutal just like you. Dinner with Dad was stressful enough as a teen. Now imagine your dad is King Philip II of Macedon, a guy juggling diplomacy, war, and at least 7 wives like it was a competitive sport. Welcome to royal dinner time, where warm food and conversations could get you exiled. Philip's dinners were probably lavish by Macedonian standards, but still nowhere near the Roman glutton fest roasted meats, thick stews with lentils, boiled grains, and a jug of recycled wine. The man was famous for liking his booze. Historical sources politely call him a heavy drinker. That's ancient historian code for your dad got wasted. In contrast, Alexander often abstained or drank very little, not because he hated wine, but because Philip had a habit of mixing politics with Pinot, and young Alexander mapped out strategies around his dad like a little general, trying to run an entire empire with just jaw power. So, when it comes to the Macedonian lunchbox, don't picture a cute bento box. Imagine a burlap sack full of calories that hate you, enough to keep you alive, working, and brutal as you are. Dinner with Dad was stressful enough as a teen. Now imagine your dad is King Philip II of Macedon, a man juggling diplomacy, war, and at least 7 wives like it's an extreme sport. Welcome to mealtime at the Royal Banquet, where warm food and conversations could land you in exile. Philip's dinner was probably lavish by Macedonian standards, but still a far cry from the Roman binge fest roasted meat. Thick stews with lentils, boiled grains, and a jug of reused wine. This guy was famously fond of drinking. Historical sources politely call him a heavy drinker. That's ancient biographer speak for your dad got wasted. In contrast, Alexander usually abstained or drank very little, not because he disliked wine, but because Philip had a nasty habit of mixing politics with his Pinot. And young Alexander was strategizing around him like a mini general. Nothing kills your appetite like watching your dad negotiate a military alliance. Between bites of roasted lamb and tense small talk, you've got military advisors, border disputes, poets reciting verses between sips of wine, and philosophers calmly insulting each other in ancient Greek. Meanwhile, Alexander quietly nibbled on cheese and plotted to take down his own dad. Spoiler alert, he actually did it. Took down his dad. Seriously, he pulled it off. Every now and then, Philip would bring back weird ingredients or dishes from around the Greek world, spiced fish, honey cakes, or exotic herbs. He'd toss out polite comments, but always circled back to the basics. Bread, meat, wine safe, predictable, perfect for building an empire. The emotional side of these dinners, non-existent. Let's just say therapy wasn't a thing yet. Philip was both the ideal role model and a migraine wrapped in sandals. Their relationship part love, part gladiator match, drunken insults flying all over the place. Yeah, that was a thing, and this was before anyone tried to assassinate Philip with a spear. So yeah, dinner with Dad was a real bonding moment. It sharpened Alexander's political instincts, toughened his resolve, and probably made him prefer quiet meals with less stabbing for the rest of his life. Now, let's talk about Alexander on the road. Not just any road, but one stretching through scorching deserts, snowy mountain passes, and sometimes over the burning corpses of his enemies. What do you eat on a lunch break like that? A perfect blend of despair and tactical nutrition. Alexander's army's field rations were not about flavor. They were about survival, mobility, and ideally not dying mid-march. Picture a linen bag stuffed with barley bread, onions, and jerky, easy to carry, immortal, and basically toxic in texture, dense, hard bread with zero flavor. If you can chew it without breaking a tooth, congrats, you're fit for service. These loaves doubled as tools, shields, and in extreme cases, morale boosters. Heat them over a campfire and they're almost edible. Cold might as well bite a rock. The meat, if there was any, was salted beyond recognition. Goat, lamb, or beef sliced thin, sun-dried, and salted until it was more mineral than meat. This wasn't jerky. This was ancient dental torture material. Still, it held up well, and if soaked long enough in water or wine, it might even bend. Onions and garlic were constant companions, not because they're tasty, but cheap, spicy, and supposedly endurance boosters. Nothing says, "I'm ready for battle," like breath that clears a room faster than defeat. To hydrate, they diluted wine, not enough to get drunk, but enough to mask the taste of saddle leather and regret. Straight water was rarely safe, especially 700 miles into Persia, where local streams were basically cursed. There were exceptions. Occasionally, after a victory, Alexander allowed a feast roasted animals, flatbreads with herbs, wine that didn't taste like boiled sneakers, but those were super rare and always followed by another brutal march. It was never luxury for luxury's sake. It was survival fuel. Sure, battlefield rations weren't gourmet, but they kept you alive, alert, and angry enough to face the next empire. And Alexander ate the same stuff, not because he had to, but because he believed no one deserved better food than his army. Imagine this: you've marched for days under blazing sun. Your sandals are basically sad leather scraps, and your throat feels cursed by the sun. God Helios himself. Suddenly, a soldier spots a tiny puddle. Not a stream, not a spring, just a muddy puddle, probably frog infested, scoops it up in his helmet. Now, here's the history part. Not because he had to, but because he believed no one deserved better food than his army. Imagine this: you've been marching for days under a blazing sun. Your sandals are basically sad leather scraps, and your throat feels like it's been cursed by the sun. God Helios himself. Suddenly, a soldier finds a tiny puddle, not a spring, not a stream, just a muddy puddle, probably where some frog just took a swim and scooped some water into his helmet. Now here comes the history part. That soldier offers it to Alexander, the king of kings, Persian army destroyer, world conqueror. Alexander just looks at the water, thanks the guy, and then dumps it on the ground in front of everyone. One of the most iconic and heartbreaking moments in Alexander's life, not because of what he drank or that he drank it, but because of what he didn't drink. But wait, why the helmet? Because in the ancient world, cooking gear was optional, but helmets were standard issue. They were your cup, bowl, face shield, and emergency bucket all in one. Was the water safe? Probably not. Ancient armies didn't have better filters, but that wasn't the point. With a simple move, Alexander turned dehydration into a team-building exercise, like a reliable office guy, but dustier and with more worn-out sandals. And the legend lives on. Writers like Arrian and Plutarch never got tired of this story, because here's a guy who didn't just lead with strategy. He led by staging shared suffering. He was hungry when they were hungry. He walked when they walked, and when the only water looked like donkey hoof prints, he still refused to drink in front of his men. Genius, really. Anyone can share a feast, but not drinking booze with someone that's emotional warfare. So next time you sip bottled water and complain it's not cold enough, remember Alexander staring at a warm frog soup helmet and saying, "No thanks, I'll wait." And his army loved him for it. Conquering an empire has its perks. One of them, upgrading your food scene. When Alexander marched into Persia, He wasn't just greeted by trembling nobles and empty palaces. He was welcomed with lavish feasts that made Macedonian bread look like gravel in a napkin. Persian cuisine was no joke. They gave the world pilaf, saffron, lamb stew with pomegranate sauce, and about 47 types of sweets that all looked like honey candy. Their royal banquets were decked out with gold plates, crystal glasses, weird fruits stacked like pyramids, and enough roasted meat to scare a small forest. Then Alexander, the king of barley porridge and philosophical restraint, stepped into this foodie dream like a Spartan walking into Whole Foods. Did he indulge occasionally? He wasn't a stone statue. Sources say he tried saffron rice, date pastries, and spirits so strong they needed a map. But overall, he kept his diet surprisingly modest. He preferred bread, meat, and water over any jewel-studded stew or gold-coated fig. This wasn't just personal taste. It was a statement to Alexander. Overindulgence meant weakness, and weakness, in his worldview, meant losing an empire. So while Persian nobles lounged on silk cushions, nibbling stuffed quail, Alexander was still crunching on his reliable barley biscuit, probably wishing it came with a side of existential meaning. Meanwhile, he let his men enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat, they deserved a night or a dozen nights of feasting: roast lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all served on plates so fancy they probably had their own inheritance plans. But Alexander stayed cautious. He'd seen what happens when luxury sinks in. A soft belly isn't a great shield on the battlefield. Still, he wasn't completely immune. Some Persian ingredients like rosewater and cinnamon supposedly made it onto his plate. After all, flavor isn't betrayal. Yeah, Persia sent a buffet, and Alexander sampled it. But in the end, he still dined like a guy who had to cross deserts, chase enemies, and deeply mistrust anything shiny on a plate. Alexander never really sat down for dinner with Darius III, but he definitely ate because of Darius III's was weakness, and weakness in his worldview meant empire loss. So while Persian nobles lounged on silk cushions, nibbling stuffed quail, Alexander was still gnawing on his trusty barley biscuit, probably wishing it carried some existential meaning. Still, he let his men enjoy the spoils. After years of dust and boiled goat meat, they deserved a night or 12 of feasting: roast lamb, grilled fish, honey cakes, all served on plates so fancy they probably had their own inheritance plans. But Alexander stayed cautious. He'd seen what happened when leaders let luxury sink into their souls. A soft belly isn't much of a shield on the battlefield, yet he wasn't completely immune. Some Persian ingredients, like rosewater and cinnamon, reportedly made it into his meals. After all, flavor isn't treason. Yeah, Persia sent a buffet, and Alexander tasted it. But in the end, he still dined like a guy crossing deserts, chasing enemies, suspicious of anything shiny on his plate. Alexander never actually sat down with Darius III for dinner, but he definitely ate because of Darius III. After chasing the Persian king across Asia like the world's most persistent food delivery guy, Alexander ended up inheriting more than just the throne. He inherited all his food, too. We're talking about a royal kitchen upgrade. Darius didn't. Just bring a couple of chefs and a pot. He rolled deep with hundreds of cooks, bakers, spice handlers, and food tasters, whose job was basically eat this, or it kills the king. It was less a military camp and more a royal palace in Persepolis. Why historians still argue. Some say it was symbolic, others say revenge. Some think it was just his drunk friends daring him. You know how it goes. Just drink too much fermented grape juice, and suddenly you torch a world wonder. Alexander woke up feeling luxury scene previously reserved for immortals and people with fragile egos. Golden plates, tables wobbling, under slow-roasted lamb, saffron rice, fish wrapped in fig leaves, and sauces aged longer than most Macedonian soldiers had ever tasted. How did Alexander react? Well, like a guy raised on onions and skepticism, he sat up straight, allegedly ignoring the comfy couch, quietly eating while everyone else lounged back, trying hard not to make eye contact with their very intense conqueror. No scowling, no laziness, just purposeful chewing with a side of judging. Not rude, but intentional signaling. Alexander didn't want to be caught playing Persian prince. He wanted everyone, especially those awkward ex-Persian nobles, now sheepishly pledging loyalty, to know he was still Macedonian, still disciplined, and still ready to flip the whole table if things got too comfy. But don't kid yourself. He liked the variety. Sources say Alexander adopted some Persian dining customs, like multi-course meals and occasional floral-flavored wine. He wasn't shy about enjoying good food, just enough to keep it balanced. So no, he didn't dine with Darius the old-fashioned way. He dined in Darius's chair with Darius's silverware, surrounded by Darius's horrified chefs. Somehow, this was even more satisfying. After all, revenge is best served on a golden plate alongside roast goat and political power. Alexander the Great was famous for many things: tactical genius, unstoppable ambition, conquering the world before 33. But tonight's menu was wine. Too much wine. Enough to make Dionysus say, "Hey, slow it down, buddy." Despite his usual self-control, there were rare, dramatic, and slightly tragic moments when Alexander dove headfirst into the cup. The most infamous of these happened in Persia, where the victorious hero, surrounded by luxury and a bunch of nodding yes-men, threw a lavish party. What was served? Probably a feast of Persian delights: roasted lamb, pilaf, spiced fruit, date syrup, and wine poured like it owed someone money. There were lengthy, emotional toasts, maybe some dramatic Homer recitations, and tears for Achilles. Then things went south after many increasingly vague diplomatic rounds. Alexander, reportedly drunk but still royal, decided to torch the royal palace at Persepolis. Why historians still argue. Some say symbolic gesture, others say revenge. Some suspect it was a drunken dare. You know how it goes. Drink too much fermented grape juice, and suddenly you're accidentally burning down a world wonder. Alexander woke up feeling the hangover equivalent of a slightly charred empire, maybe the first recorded case of post-booze regret in military history, not the only case of drunken leadership. Other stories tell of brawls after banquets, including one tragic evening when Alexander, wasted, killed his best buddy Cletus, who just so happened to have saved his life in battle. That night ended with vomiting, tears, and a full-blown existential crisis. Just another Friday in Babylon. The takeaway for a control freak like him: alcohol was his one blind spot, and the more successful he got, the harder it was. Like he had a hangover and a slightly charred empire, probably the first recorded moment of regret after drinking in military history. This wasn't a one-off drunk leadership fail. Other stories tell of brawls breaking out after banquets, including a tragic night when Alexander, drunk, killed his best friend Cletus, the same guy who saved his life in battle. That night ended with puke, tears, and an existential crisis. Just a regular Friday in Babylon. Takeout food for a control freak like him. Alcohol was his blind spot, and the more successful he got, the harder it was to keep booze and sycophants in check. Yeah, sometimes Alexander drank too much, and when he did, he was also the guy who once saved the man's life in battle. That night ended with puking, tears, and a full-on existential crisis. Just another Friday night in Babylon. Takeout food for a control freak. Booze was his one blind spot. The more successful he got, the harder it was to keep the alcohol and the yes men from spilling all over the place. Yep. Sometimes Alexander drank way too much, and when he did, he wasn't king or god, just a drunken guy with terrible taste, and unfortunately, a torch. Marching into India wasn't just a geopolitical move, it was a brutal test for Alexander and his exhausted army, crossing scorching deserts and trudging through icy mountain passes. And now here they were, staring down spices they couldn't even pronounce, and animals that looked like fortress towers with tusks. When it came to food, India was a whole new world. This was the land of lentils, rice, ginger, turmeric, tamarind, and enough chili to turn a Macedonian helmet into a sauna cap. Ancient sources, vague and a bit sketchy as usual, describe the army encountering new flavors, curries, fragrant stews, and veggies, cooked not to mushy oblivion. Alexander apparently liked this, though he preferred simple fare. He was curious, adaptable, and smart enough to know you don't insult local cuisine when you're technically invading. So, he tried their food. He respected their traditions. But he didn't learn to cook. That job was still someone else's problem. Meanwhile, his soldiers, they didn't adapt so gracefully. Macedonian troops were trained to hunt meat, bread, and grumble in equal measure. Spiced lentils and weird fruits were met with suspicion or, in some cases, loud complaints, loud enough to scare even the elephants. Rumor has it many soldiers started missing their traditional barley stew, which is to say, if you could call barley stew tasty, then came the elephants, not for dinner, but for battlefield muscle. Alexander, ever the pragmatist, probably looked at a war elephant and said, "All right, we won't eat it, but will definitely rent a few. Still, Indian hospitality showed up in big feasts full of rich flavors, spiced goat stew, fried dough, and desserts made from dates, even if Alexander only took a small portion. He couldn't ignore the generosity. In fact, some reports say he sent food back to his troops to boost morale, which is just fancy old school general talk for try this and stop whining. In the end, India didn't just expand the empire's borders, it expanded their taste buds, their spice tolerance, and their emergency bathroom planning skills. And for a guy who once thought lunch meant pickled onions, this was growth. You can conquer Persia, march through Egypt, invade India, and dine with kings. But lentils always find their way back to you. For Alexander, no matter how far he roamed or how many fancy banquets he enjoyed, he always came back to the culinary equivalent of a shrug-boiled lentils. Humble, simple, with a texture somewhere between soggy grit and warm suspicion. Lentils were the guiding star of his diet. So, was he really into lentils? Probably not. No kid dreams of ruling the world while chomping on mushy beans. But lentils were practical, nutritious, and, most importantly, politically neutral. They didn't flaunt luxury, spark envy, or cause diplomatic incidents. They were just there like your least exciting flip-flops or that boring but loyal advisor in a world of weird foods and dangerous feasts. Lentils were safe, no shady origins, no translations needed, and definitely no palace burnings. See the wine chapter. Chapter 9, for a ruler who slept with a dagger under his pillow. This was the perfect food traditionally. Lentils had long been a staple for Greeks and Macedonians, high in protein, easy to store, and cooked with just a pot and fire, no fancy stuff needed. Add a splash of vinegar or oil, maybe some minced garlic if you're feeling fancy, and voila. The ancient version of I'm too tired to cook. Some sources say even in Babylon, where every spice, roast, and delicacy imaginable was available, Alexander still requested simple meals, with lentils, of course, on the menu. Diplomatic mishaps. They're just there like your trusty, boring flip-flops or that one advisor who's loyal but dull. In the world of weird foods and dangerous feasts, lentils are the safe bet. They don't come from shady sources. These texts don't need translating and definitely won't lead to palace burnings. See the wine chapter. Chapter 9, for a ruler who sleeps with a dagger under his pillow. This is the perfect meal, traditionally. Lentils have long been a staple in the diets of Greeks and Macedonians, high in protein, easy to store, and can be cooked with just a pot and fire, no fancy stuff needed. Add a splash of vinegar or oil, maybe some chopped garlic if you're feeling fancy, and boom, you've got the ancient version of I'm too tired to cook. Some sources say even in Babylon, with all its spices, roasts, and imaginable delicacies. Alexander still went for simple meals, and lentils, of course, were on that list. Not a punishment, more like a philosophy, a nod to discipline, and maybe a subtle shift. I could eat honey-glazed quail wrapped in gold leaf, but I choose mushy brown beans instead. It's also possible lentils reminded him of home, training on the hills of Macedonia, dinners with Aristotle where food came with moral lessons, and military camps where the only constant was the tragic sound of chewing something sad. Yep, lentils made a comeback, not with a bang, just a soft drop into a wooden bowl. And Alexander, emperor of half the known world, picked up his spoon and ate, because even greatness needs fiber when you think royal snacks. You might. Edibility wasn't measured by flavor, but by whether the snack could survive being stuffed in a saddlebag, trampled by horses, and still technically be edible. Enter dried figs, olives, roasted chickpeas, nuts, and aged goat cheese so hard it could double as a weapon. These were the granola bars of the ancient world, compact, sturdy, and totally unromantic. Dried figs were the favorite, easy to carry, sticky, loaded with sugar and energy. Perfect for when you have to conquer cities before lunch. Olives were salty, oily, and guaranteed to stain your fancy clothes at the worst possible diplomatic moments. But hey, electrolytes. Meanwhile, roasted chickpeas were the popcorn of antiquity, crunchy, satisfying, and plentiful, though sadly butter-free. Nuts, especially almonds and walnuts, packed protein, fat, and gave you something to chew on while debating whether to cross yet another mountain range. Alexander's commanders probably carried the same stuff, sometimes wrapped in cloth or stashed in little leather pouches. No Tupperware, no vacuum seals, just dusty snacks passed around between sword fights. And of course, there was always a fine layer of dust, not something anyone aimed to eat, but unavoidable. Everything had a coating like that. Bread, meat, figs. There's a reason ancient soldiers had bad teeth. They constantly chewed on dirt and pretended it was seasoning. Some records even say Alexander, despite having access to finer foods, often ate like his soldiers. He didn't want to seem aloof or pampered, snacking on goat cheese while sitting on a rock with his men. That was ancient military protocol, folks. So royal snacks, not luxurious, durable, functional, and mostly flavored by environment for Alexander. That meant ambition, road dust, and the occasional fig. Every empire has its culinary over-the-top moments, and Alexander's conquests were no exception. While his daily meals were practical and even aesthetic, there were occasional parties, especially after victories, where things got downright weird. Not weird like exotic salt, but weird like fire-breathing dancers, victory feasts, mixed diplomatic theater with full-on gluttony. You'd see Persian nobles trying not to sob into their gold napkins, Macedonian soldiers wondering if honey lizards were a prank, and Alexander sitting at the head, trying to keep it from turning into a booze-fueled war zone. These parties featured giant roasted animals too big for any table, bowls of pomegranate-soaked rice, bird-shaped pastries, and wine poured by guys wearing more jewelry than clothes, plus live performances, music, poetry, acrobatics, and maybe one or two elephants doing something symbolic and vaguely threatening. But the real chaos kicked off with the toasts. Macedonian tradition didn't just encourage drinking, it weaponized it. Men tried to out-toast each other in both booze and emotional monologues. The night started with Alexander and ended with someone yelling, "I'd die for your sandals," while sobbing into a leg of lamb. One of the most famous disastrous parties went down in Samarkand, where Alexander tried to merge Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples celebrate as equals. Expect the basics of ancient military grub, so royal snacks, not fancy, durable, functional, mostly influenced by the environment. For Alexander, they tasted like ambition, road dust, and the occasional figs. Every empire has its moments of culinary excess, and Alexander's conquests were no exception. While his daily meals were practical and tasteful, there were occasional feasts, especially after victories. When things got weird, not weird like strange salt, but more like fire-breathing dancers weird, victory parties were a mix of diplomatic theater and all-you-can-eat madness. You'd see Persian nobles trying not to sob into their gold napkins, Macedonian soldiers wondering if honey lizards were a prank, and Alexander sitting at the head, trying to keep things from turning into a booze-fueled war. These parties featured enormous roasted beasts that couldn't fit on a table, bowls of pomegranate-drenched rice, bird-shaped pastries, and wine poured by men wearing more bling than clothes, plus live performances, music, poetry, acrobatics, maybe one or two elephants doing something symbolic and vaguely threatening. But the real chaos kicked in with the toasts. Macedonian tradition didn't just encourage drinking, it weaponized it. Guys would try to out-toast each other in booze and emotional monologues. The story starts with Alexander and ends with someone yelling, "I'll die for your sandals," while bawling into a lamb leg. One of the most infamous party breakdowns happened in Samarkand, where Alexander tried to blend Macedonian and Persian traditions by having both peoples celebrate as equals. Great idea. But logistical nightmare, language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the fact that Persian cuisine had sauces, while Macedonian food saw salt as a luxury, plates definitely got flipped. Sometimes the weirdness was accidental, like when Alexander threw a party in a newly conquered city, still smelling of smoke, or when people brought extravagant tribute dishes, like live peacocks, or a dessert that required 6 servants and the patience of a saint. These parties weren't just meals, they were political power plays, team-building events, morale boosters, and sometimes harsh lessons in why you should never let the guy from Thrace anywhere near the wine jar. Yeah, Alexander could party, but even then, he was a pretty moderate eater, a careful drinker, and always watching like a history nerd taking notes. When Alexander hit Babylon, he wasn't just a king, he was a global brand with a diet featuring ingredients from Greece, Persia, India, and whatever they grilled in Bactria. Of course, Babylon rolled out the red carpet, and when we say red carpet, we mean parties that made the Olympic opening ceremony look like a backyard BBQ. This was the high point of his culinary journey. Babylonian chefs were masters of extravagance. They served grain-fed lamb, spiced date wine, cooked fruits, and a ridiculous array of sauces. usually with something golden on the side. The meal came in courses with music, incense, and the faint smell of glory, or maybe just exhaustion, probably both. Alexander's dining table was now a geopolitical event. Sitting next to him were Persian governors, Indian envoys, Greek generals, and maybe a philosopher or two pretending they didn't hate the dill. But despite this spectacle, Alexander mostly kept his meals simple. He didn't stuff himself or cover himself in honey. He stuck to old habits: bread, meat, maybe a little wine, even as stuffed peacocks paraded by. Part discipline, part political message. Yes, I rule the world, but I'm humble enough to chew dry meat like a peasant. Then came the last party. There are plenty of conflicting reports. Ancient historians weren't exactly fact checkers, but most agree Alexander attended a big feast, maybe to honor a god, a friend, or just to survive another Thursday. There was food, lots of wine. Then he got sick. Was it poisoning, fever, malaria, liver failure after years of world domination? We'll never know. What we do know is Alexander spent 11 days bedridden, unable to speak, eat, or stand. The guy who conquered continents couldn't even sip water. No detailed notes on his last meal, probably not a grand affair. Maybe just a cup of wine or a damp cloth on his lips. The conqueror's journey ended like all mortal journeys, quietly, humbly, and maybe hungry. The party was over. The man was done. And in Babylon, the feast was cleared away, and history began. Now imagine for a second that Alexander the Great showed up in the modern world, dusty cloak and all, slightly confused by escalators, and found himself in a food court line. What would he order? Let's be clear, Alexander wasn't into fluff. He wasn't indecisive, and he definitely didn't believe in building his own bowl. He'd scan the menu: fusion tacos, rainbow smoothies, all things fried crispy, and probably pick something simple, portable, and packed with protein. He'd skip the sugary trends and go straight for the grilled lamb, nodding approvingly at the spinning meat like it was a mini war chariot. Barley energy bars, familiar fare, lentil soup, comfort food from the past, roasted onions, only if they reminded him of conquest and poor impulse control. Fast food might confuse him, but military efficiency could sell it. Expected. And he definitely didn't believe in building his own bowl. He'd scan the options: fusion tacos, rainbow smoothies, all things crispy, and probably pick something simple, portable, and packed with protein. He'd skip the sugary trendy stuff and probably go straight for the grilled lamb, nodding along, admiring that round roast that looks like a tiny war chariot. Energy bars made from barley, the humble lentil soup, a favorite dish that drags memories from the past. Roasted onions are fine, but only if their smell reminds him of conquest and poor impulse control. Fast food might confuse the guy, but military efficiency could win him over. Respect the man. The idea of cooking in under 2 minutes would seem like witchcraft in Macedonia, though he'd probably want to inspect the kitchen and maybe conquer that too. Forced to choose from a modern menu, he'd have a lot of questions. Why's this called Caesar salad? Wasn't he stabbed at the Forum? And what's up with this chicken? Which general is this guy? And that milkshake hilarious? What animal did you milk to get sugar health-wise? The guy probably thrived. His original diet, low carb, focused on a 20-minute walk before breakfast, was approved by plenty of influencers. Basically, he invented the paleo diet. Keto, just a campaign phase. But even with all this novelty, Alexander probably craved simplicity, a flatbread, some roasted meat, a glass of wine mixed. Of course, since he wasn't a savage, no fancy flaky pastries, no buttered toast, definitely no food served in glass jars. Why? Because Alexander wasn't just a foodie, he was a man on a mission. Food was fuel, a tool, sometimes a morale booster, but never the main event. So if you ever find yourself stuck trying to decide what to order, just ask, would Alexander eat this? Or just add it to the pile suddenly. That lentil wrap might not seem so boring. In the twilight days of the ancient world, when the Mediterranean's greatest minds still gathered under colonnades debating the nature of the universe, a woman named Hypatia stood at the center of it all, born around 360 AD in Alexandria, a melting pot of intellectual cultures. She wasn't considered a leader, according to the customs back then, but she didn't just dabble in philosophy and science. She excelled. Her father, Theon, was a respected mathematician and philosopher connected to the Great Museum of Alexandria, an academic hub still holding on to the fading legacy of the once a mighty library. But while most dads taught their sons to read and ride horses, Theon poured all his effort into his daughter. He taught Hypatia arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and Plato's philosophy. She didn't just memorize theory. She questioned, debated, and taught others. As she grew up, Hypatia outshone her father in both intellect and influence. Her lectures drew students from across the empire, pagans, Christians, skeptics, fanatics alike. She taught openly on streets and lecture halls, rocking the philosopher's robe, grabbing attention not through authority but clarity. She explained celestial motions, conic sections, and number properties so brilliantly that people described her as almost divine. And this wasn't some dusty scholar hiding away in a forgotten room. Hypatia freely navigated the male-dominated world of late Roman Egypt, advising city officials and even the Roman governor. She was the embodiment of the old world, the classical world, a world rapidly sliding under waves of religious change and imperial chaos. But Alexandria wasn't just the city of books anymore. It had become a battleground for beliefs. Christianity was rising, paganism fading, and politics getting messier than any equation. Hypatia's fame, independence, and her status as a symbol of rational classical thought started stirring jealousy and rage among those who valued revelation over reason. Yet, in those early years, she remained untouchable. Hypatia was the last light of a dying era, a woman revered not because she fit into the men's world, but because she rose above it. In an age when women were expected to marry, have kids, and steer clear of lecture halls, Hypatia did something radically rebellious. She chose the life of the mind, And more importantly, Alexandria let her presence was fierce, but her intellect made it hard to argue with her. Hypatia didn't crash the intellectual circle on her own. She was invited. Mastery of math and astronomy propelled her to the forefront of the intellectual circle. She got invited. Mastery of math and astronomy vaulted her to the forefront of Neoplatonism, a philosophical mashup of Plato's teachings and mystical vibes. Think lofty ideas about the soul's journey, the ultimate reality, and a ladder between matter and the divine, all laid out with geometric precision. Hypatia's lectures weren't your usual dull academic snooze fests. Her reputation was magnetic. Students came not just from Alexandria, but all over the empire, eager to learn, to sit at her feet. Many were high-class Roman guys, ironically learning logic and discipline from a woman their society wanted silenced. She taught openly, not in secret. She'd ride through town in her philosopher's cloak, turning heads at forums and arenas, often speaking in front of rowdy crowds. It wasn't just her smarts that grabbed attention, but her personality too. Hypatia was known for valuing aesthetics, not wealth or pleasure. She probably stayed single on purpose to keep her independence and philosophical purity. According to a story maybe fake, but worth noting, when a student tried to woo her, she threw a blood-soaked menstrual rag at him, saying, "This is what you love, young man, not my beauty." Message received. Still, despite her stoic vibe, she wasn't cold. Many students admired her, not just as a teacher, but as a moral guide. Some later became bishops, judges, and governors, especially Synesius of Cyrene, one of her most devoted pupils, who became a Christian bishop but kept lifelong respect for Hypatia, writing to her like a combo fan letter, philosophy inquiry, and spiritual therapy session. She wasn't just a scholar, she was the living soul of ancient Alexandria. Science, philosophy, tolerance, and wicked smarts all wrapped up in a world getting less and less tolerant by the day. As Hypatia hit her intellectual peak, the Alexandria Library, once the crown jewel of human knowledge, was just a shadow of its former self. The original structure had been wrecked by wars, neglect, and political chaos. What was left was scattered around the city, appendices, scrolls kept in private collections, and a few scholars still clinging to the dream of universal knowledge, and none shined brighter than Hypatia, though not the official librarian of the remnants. Many saw her as the rightful heir to that legacy. She edited and preserved key mathematical texts, most notably works by Diophantus and Apollonius. Some scholars even think she helped design astrolabes and salinometers tools, crucial for astronomy and measurement. Yep. She wasn't just guessing about the stars, she was helping build the gadgets to watch them. Then there's her commentary on Ptolemy's Almagest, a complex astronomy treatise packed with math models explaining planetary motion. Most people couldn't even pronounce it, let alone improve it, but Hypatia's revisions made it more accessible for future generations, ensuring it survived through the ages. Ironically, Her translation became the standard in Arabic versions. Centuries later, long after the Roman world forgot her name, but Hypatia wasn't about hoarding knowledge. She believed in sharing it nonstop. Her classroom was wherever she stood, whether sketching parabolas or analyzing Plato's forms. She never saw science and philosophy as separate. To her, mind and universe were one huge, interconnected system. This belief earned her respect, but also made her vulnerable. Alexandria was changing, Christian bishops gaining power, temples turned into churches, and suspicion of pagan knowledge spreads. Hypatia, a philosopher rooted in classical tradition, started being seen not just as a teacher, but a threat. A woman teaching astronomy instead of theology, questioning instead of obeying, openly unaffiliated with any religion. It didn't matter that some students were Christian or that she wasn't hostile to the church. What mattered was the symbolism. Hypatia represented the old world, the world of reason and inquiry, and in a city turning into a fanatic cult that's way more dangerous than any scroll. By the early 5th century, Alexandria was no longer the peaceful cradle of learning it once fancied itself to be. It had turned into a pressure cooker of religious rage, political backstabbing, and street violence. Hypatia, whether she liked it or not, became more than just a philosopher. She turned into a symbol, and symbols love to attract mobs. The tension in the city was thick. On one side, you had the pagan elite and intellectuals clinging to the dying embers of Greco-Roman culture. On the other, the Christian wave was rising fast, not the oppressed minority anymore, but a politically dominant, swaggering force. In the middle, the Roman administrators were trying to keep peace with all the effectiveness of a guy trying to mop the ocean. The newly appointed Christian bishop of Alexandria, Cyril, was ambitious, influential, and dead set on cementing the church's power over the city. His rival was Orestes, the Roman governor, a Christian himself, but a political pragmatist. More tolerant of Alexandria's traditional pluralism, the two men hated each other, and in that boiling cauldron of hostility, Hypatia accidentally became a lightning rod. She was widely respected and often served as a trusted advisor, but she firmly held a neutral religious stance, refusing to convert, refusing to pick sides, refusing to disappear. In a time when neutrality was seen as betrayal, that was a problem. The Christian community, especially its more militant factions, started whispering that Hypatia was the reason for the conflict between Orestes and Cyril. She was accused of casting spells, manipulating politics with pagan magic, blocking Alexandria from its Christian destiny. Of course, that was nonsense, but when a city is drunk on zeal and blood, nonsense spreads faster than reason. Meanwhile, a group called the Parabolani, basically religious enforcers or muscle-bound monks, were gaining influence under Cyril's command, originally set up to care for the sick and bury the dead. They increasingly looked like a paramilitary force, enforcing church power on the streets. And then there was Hypatia, smart, independent, respected by the Roman powers, but an unrepentant pagan in her worldview, calmly riding through town like she had no target on her back. But in the new Alexandria order, no one stands long in the line of fire. Cyril of Alexandria didn't come to power for an easy ride. Succeeding his uncle Theophilus as bishop in 412 AD, Cyril inherited a church ready to dominate and wasn't just interested in being a spiritual leader. He wielded theology like a sword and politics like a dagger, and Alexandria, torn by ideological divides, was the perfect battleground for his campaign. Cyril's mission had two parts: wipe out heresy and asserted the church's supremacy over civil authority. And he didn't waste any time. He shut down Novatian churches, kicked Jews out of the city, and expanded his influence both from the pulpit and on the streets. His sermons weren't just inspiring, they were rallying cries. He knew the power of spectacle, mixing holy words with muscle and the parabolani. The church's unofficial fight club were his boots on the ground. Of course, this didn't sit well with the royal governor. Though a Christian himself, Orestes maintained Rome's long tradition of religious tolerance. He opposed Cyril's aggressive moves, especially the ones that broke civil laws. Their relationship nosedived faster than a marble-down temple stairs. The arrests were done diplomatically. Orestes tried to stop them. What he got instead was violence, when a Christian mob tried to assassinate him by hurling stones during a public speech. A monk named Ammonius was caught and shutting down Novatian churches, kicking Jews out of the city, and expanding his influence from the pulpit to the streets. His sermons weren't just inspiring, they rallied people. He knew showmanship worked when mixing sacred words with muscle and the parabolani. The church's unofficial brawlers were his boots on the ground. Of course, this didn't sit well with the royal governor's arrest. Even a Christian caught had to respect Rome's long tradition of religious tolerance. He opposed Cyril's aggressive moves, especially those breaking civil law. Their relationship nosedived faster than a ball rolling down temple stairs. The arrest happened with political finesse. He tried to stop it. What he got was violence. When a Christian mob tried to stone him during a public speech, a monk named Ammonius was arrested and executed for assault. Cyril hailed him as a martyr. The crack turned into an open wound, and Hypatia got dragged into it. This risky power grab earned respect from the arrested, hatred from Cyril's followers, and guaranteed chaos. Moving on, she didn't openly care for politics, but her smarts and influence made her a threat. Her very existence undermined the idea that wisdom only came through the church. A woman, a pagan, an astronomer, and a close advisor to the biggest political enemy of Cyril. Hypatia's lack of an army or power hunger didn't matter. In a city where theology and power blurred into one, neutrality was the most dangerous stance. And the silence from Cyril about the growing whispers was downright scary, because in Alexandria, once people start accusing someone of witchcraft, it's just a matter of time before someone lights the match. By 414 AD, Alexandria had turned into a city where truth didn't matter for conviction, only suspicion, and the mob did. Hypatia, once celebrated across the empire as an unmatched philosopher, was now being recast by her enemies in a much darker shade. The rumors spread like plague that she was a witch, that she held prisoners under magical spells, that she was plotting against the church. None of it had any truth, but facts were out of fashion. Most anti-Hypatia propaganda targeted her fame. She was a public figure, riding carriages, teaching, publicly consulting high officials. Such confidence from a woman offended the rigid worldview deeply ingrained in Alexandria's hardline religious crowd. To them, Hypatia was everything wrong with the old world. She was a woman, a philosopher, and stubbornly refused to convert. Rumors said she worshipped demons, practiced dark magic, and that her astrolabe was a magical tool to bend human willpower. In reality, they're just scientific tools. But science, in an era ruled by religious extremism, can look pretty much like magic to folks who don't get it or don't want to. There's even a tale accusing her of blocking the reconciliation between Orestes and Bishop Cyril. The logic goes like this. Hypatia advises Orestes. Orestes targets Cyril, so Hypatia must be the root of the conflict. A neat, convenient, simple little deduction, but it's fatally wrong. The streets erupt in chaos. The question isn't whether something happens to Hypatia anymore. It's when and how violently the Parabolani, once humble caregivers of the poor, have turned into raging fanatics, hungry for an ideal, and most Christians in this city already saw Hypatia as a dangerous pagan witch. It took just a nod to set them loose. That nod Cyril never gave it publicly. He was too cautious for that. But his refusal to condemn rumors, to calm the panic, and his public defense of a woman he surely knew was innocent, said a lot. After all, silence is just another kind of signal, and then the trap slowly snapped shut, invisibly, around Hypatia, not with chains, but whispers and pointing fingers, the kind of prison you don't see until it's way too late. This happened in spring of 415 AD. Hypatia, now in her 50s, still rode her carriage through Alexandria's streets, still teaching students and daring to exist despite the nasty stories her enemies spun. Maybe she sensed the danger. Hostile glares grew sharper, whispers became daggers, and the air thickened with menace. But she kept going, like a living rebuke to fanaticism. Then one day, they came for her, not a trial, not an official execution, but a furious, self-righteous mob filled with hatred, led by the Parabolani and supposedly incited by a man named Peter, a church reader. They stopped her on the street. She was dragged from her carriage, stripped naked, and dragged into a church. A sacred place turned into a butcher's den. It's hard to describe what happened next without shivering. Contemporary records, especially from the historian Socrates, Scholasticus, say the mob killed her with roof tiles or oyster shells, scraping her skin off down to the bone. Others say they tore her apart piece by piece. What we know for sure is after killing her, they burned her body, a greater insult, as if erasing every trace of her existence somehow justified the crime. This wasn't a political murder, but a passion murder fueled by ideology, not legality, no trial, no verdict, just execution by mob rage. Alexandria lost more than a woman that day. The city lost the last voice of classical tradition, its last public philosopher, and arguably the final statement of the international spirit that once defined it. Orestes couldn't do a thing. Cyril expressed regret but denied all responsibility. No arrests, no public investigation. Silence after Hypatia's death was followed by even more silence and gradual forgetfulness. But the damage was done. With Hypatia's death, a symbolic door slammed shut, marking the end of the ancient era of reason. This event marked the end of Alexandria as an intellectual capital and the start of theological decline. Her mutilated body was the full stop on centuries-long cultural erosion. A scholar was killed. A world was lost in the weeks following Hypatia's brutal murder. Alexandria fell into a chilling silence, not because peace returned, but because something essential died. The streets stayed crowded. Churches still rang their bells of fortune and misfortune. Officials still stamped papers, but the city's soul, the open exchange of ideas, the blend after Hypatia's brutal murder. Alexandria fell into a creepy silence, not because peace had returned, but because something essential had died. The streets stayed crowded. Church bells still rang, signaling fate. Officials still stamped papers, but the city's soul, the open exchange of ideas, the mix of Greek philosophy, Roman rule, and Egyptian mysticism faded forever. No justice for Hypatia, no trial, no compensation. Arrest records that once trickled down eventually vanished from history. Some say the man left Alexandria too politically isolated to govern. Others claim he was called back to Rome. Either way, the powerful guy who tried to protect her was gone, and Bishop Cyril took over this, even though Cyril denied having anything to do with her death. Many took his silence and fiery speeches as a wink and a nod. He didn't lift a finger to punish the killers, never once publicly condemned what happened. Later on, he even got canonized. Saint Cyril of Alexandria is remembered more for his holy war against heresy than for the philosopher who bled under his watch. As for Hypatia, her legacy was buried fast, both literally and intellectually. Her name got wiped from tons of records. Her works vanished, her teachings credited to others, and her math and astronomy contributions scattered in history like faint footprints. You blink, and one of antiquity's brightest minds turns into a whisper, but that whisper stuck around. Centuries later, Hypatia's story started creeping back into the spotlight, first in Renaissance humanists' writings, who hailed her as a martyr for reason. Then during the Enlightenment, she became the poster child for intellectual freedom crushed by dogma. By the 19th and 20th centuries, she was celebrated once again, the female philosopher, the last defender of Alexandria's ancient intellect, a tragic figure whose death marked the end of classical civilization. But what we know about Hypatia today mostly comes from people's stories. Students like Synesius, historians like Socrates, Scholasticus, and later chroniclers tried piecing together the mosaic of her life. The woman herself, her voice went silent, but that silence turned thunderous, despite centuries of quiet. Hypatia refused to be forgotten, her name, nearly erased, kept resurfacing whenever folks questioned power and cherished the pursuit of truth. She became more than a historical figure. She turned into a symbol, not just of a murdered scholar, but of an idea that must stand firm, even as the world turns violent during the Renaissance. Thinkers rediscovered her story and worshipped her as a martyr to ignorance. In the Enlightenment, philosophers and skeptics pointed to Hypatia as proof of what happens when religion clamps down on inquiry. Voltaire wrote about her with fury, calling her death the final nail in the coffin of classical scholarship. She starred as a tragic heroine in plays, poems, and later novels, often exaggerated, sure, but always admired in modern times. Her tale inspired scientists, feminists, and secularists alike to mathematicians. She's one of the first recorded women in the field, paving the way for today's fight for STEM representation. To women in philosophy, she's an ancient trailblazer, not only joining the intellectual scene, but shaping it. And to humanists, she's a sharp reminder of how fragile knowledge can be when fear takes over. But Hypatia's legacy isn't just symbolic. Although most of her written works disappeared, scholars suspect her influence still lingers in Greek mathematical texts. Her additions and commentaries may have slipped into Arabic scholarship and later European academia, so even in silence, her fingerprints remain on the tools of learning. There's a deep irony there. The mob tore her apart, not just to destroy the woman, but to crush everything she stood for. Yet Hypatia lives on not in temples or churches, but in the minds of generations unwilling to let her name fade. Today, statues bear her image, schools carry her name, and Greek math texts, her notes and comments might have become the versions that made it into Arabic scholarship and then European academia. So, even in silence, her fingerprints stayed all over the textbooks. There's a deep irony here. The mob tore her apart, not just to destroy the woman, but to annihilate everything she stood for. Yet Hypatia survived not in temples or churches, but in the minds of generations who refused to let her name fade away. Today, statues bear her face, schools carry her name, and thinkers from all walks pay homage as the world slips toward ignorance. She wasn't just Alexandria's last light. She was a dare to all of us to speak clearly, think boldly, and never bow down to the crowd, because truth, like Hypatia, might bleed, but it never breaks. Beneath Italy's quiet Alps, just 30 minutes from Turin, lies a secret that's hard to believe. It's not on any old map, nor advertised to tourists. No Roman ruins or medieval churches here. Instead, hidden deep under the mountain village of Vidraco is a giant underground complex carved by hand, a labyrinth of sacred rooms called the Temples of Humankind. And for nearly 2 decades, only a tiny spiritual community even knew it existed. This isn't your average little cave with a few murals. The temples stretch across 5 floors connected by hallways, spiral staircases, and vaults that could compete with any grand cathedral architecture. They're covered in sacred art, mosaics, stained glass, cosmic symbols, and golden altars, all hand-chiseled, painted, and installed like someone tried to recreate the Sistine Chapel underground, then threw in Egyptian hieroglyphs, Buddhist mandalas, Mayan glyphs, and galaxy maps to make it even more perfect. And who built this? Not the Vatican, not some secret cult with centuries-old rituals. Nope. It was a relatively unknown spiritual group calling themselves Damanhur, named after an ancient Egyptian city believed to be the center of Horus worship. Founded in 1975, this group dreamed up a society based on harmony, self-sufficiency, and spiritual evolution. The temples are the physical embodiment of that dream, a sacred space meant to realign human consciousness with the cosmos. Construction began in 1978, led by Oberto Ayaldi, a former insurance broker turned mystical prophet. No permits, no blueprints, just hand tools. Ayaldi and his followers dug into the rock beneath a private house, working at night, using the excavated earth to shape the hills, and telling absolutely no one. It was a kind of spiritual rebellion, secretly building what they believed couldn't be built in public, and they got away with it for 17 years. No one suspected that behind the humble facade of a rural house, a group of artists, engineers, and believers were creating an underground wonder. It wasn't until the 1990s that a disgruntled ex-member tipped off the authorities and the Italian police, hoping to find a hideout or tax evasion scheme, were instead confronted with one of the most astonishing underground constructions in modern Europe. The temples of humankind didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were the product of a grand, utterly unique vision born in the mind of a man named Oberto Ayaldi. Later, his followers became known as Falco in the 1970s. Ayaldi wasn't yet a spiritual guru. He had a pretty normal job as an insurance agent in northern Italy, but beneath the surface, he was obsessed with metaphysics, reincarnation, ancient civilizations, and what he called the memory of the universe. Ayaldi claimed that since childhood, he had vivid memories of past lives, not just vague impressions, but detailed images of life in lost civilizations, including Atlantis and ancient Egypt. He believed these memories weren't fantasies but blueprints, and one of those blueprints was to build a temple, not metaphorically, but literally a sanctuary for spiritual awakening, hidden underground and built by a community united by purpose. So in 1975, he gathered a small group of like-minded folks in the foothills of the Alps. They shared his dream of a self-sufficient, spiritually evolving society. The group named themselves Damanhur after the Egyptian city, reputed to be Horus's worship center and a seat of esoteric knowledge. Their mission wasn't to start a new religion, but to build a new society, one balanced between science, art, ecology, and spirituality. Damanhur grew quietly. Members gave up their old lives to join the communal life in rural Italy. They practiced meditation, sacred dance, and even invented a language they believed could enhance communication on a subtle level. They developed their own currency. They studied ancient texts and claims to be able to chat with plants to outsiders. It sounds either enchanting or just plain nuts, but to the faithful, they're laying the groundwork for the universe's grand reboot. Behind it all, though a real secret, construction started. Irauti swore he saw the temple in a vision and was convinced he had a mission to build it, armed with hoes, hammers, buckets, and stubborn faith. The Damanhur folks began digging, not knowing if they'd ever finish or just get busted. They weren't just digging into rock, they were digging deep into belief itself, crafting a shelter not for now, but for a future they were sure was coming from the outside. The house on the hill in Vidraco looks totally normal, just a humble mountain home, chilling quietly over the valley. But under the floor, behind a secret trapdoor hidden under a rug, lies the mouth of an ever-expanding tunnel. Here, under the cover of darkness and silence, the Damanhur people pulled off what can only be called an architectural miracle, building a vast underground temple entirely by hand. The work kicked off in 1978. No cranes, no excavators, no hard hat-wearing engineers, just a handful of folks with hoes, hammers, and lanterns. They dug into solid rock with basic tools, hauling out bucket after bucket of rubble, often working through the night to keep it hush-hush. The dirt they dug out was quietly spread across the landscape, sculpting gardens and terraced fields, leaving no clue that anything was happening below. This was seriously risky business. No permits, no safety rules. One small mistake, and they'd be buried alive. But the Damanhur folks believed they were protected by faith, fate, and the guidance of a higher wisdom. This wasn't just construction. It was a sacred ritual. Every hammer strike was an act of devotion. Irauti or Falco claimed he once saw the temple in a dream. Every room, every hall, every golden altar. His sketches guided the layout. The arches symbolized different spiritual principles connected by passages flooded with art and light. Each room had its purpose: meditation, healing, energy balancing. The architecture was influenced by sacred geometry and mystical symbols, not modern practicality. Even as more members joined the project, secrecy held tight. Families told stories about their kids playing on the temple floor, totally clueless about what was happening beneath their feet. Somehow, for nearly 15 years, no neighbors reported anything weird. No curious locals stumbled through the wrong door. No authorities knocked down the door. By the early 90s, they had dug out a whole underground space, big enough to hold multiple elaborately decorated halls that no outsider had ever heard of. Quite the achievement, born from persistence, madness, human artistry, or maybe all three. They didn't just build a shrine. They threw down the gauntlet to modernity by proving something ancient could be hidden right beneath its nose. For almost 17 years, humanity's temple stayed one of modern Europe's best-kept secrets. But like any secret, this one finally got busted, not with whispers, but with a big bang. In 1992, a former Daemon member, upset with the leadership, decided to spill the beans on the underground complex to the Italian government. He claimed there was a massive illegal structure buried under the Alps, unregistered, unchecked, and definitely unapproved to the government. It sounded insane, a whole temple system built by a cult without anyone noticing. Still, the officials had to investigate. When cops showed up at Vidraco, they expected to find a sketchy basement or a tiny bunker. What they found blew their minds. Walking past a hidden trapdoor, they descended into glittering vast rooms with mosaic murals, gold-plated altars, and stained glass windows, all underground, marble columns, vaulted ceilings, and sacred symbols from every spiritual tradition known to man. The officers were stunned. Some reports say they thought they'd uncovered a lost civilization. The size and artistry of these temples were beyond imagination. This wasn't just a secret room. It was a multi-level architectural marvel carved right out of the bedrock, hidden in plain sight. News of the discovery spread fast, and public reaction was a chaotic mix of excitement, outrage, and administrative panic. The Italian government, initially worried, slapped an immediate stop work order and threatened to seal the complex forever. After all, no permits had been filed, and serious structural safety concerns loomed. But then came a surprise. Instead of fear or ridicule, the public was fascinated. Photos of the rooms, especially the mirror hall and the Green Temple, started flooding Italian newspapers. People were hooked. Who were these folks? How did they build it? And why Damon, now facing extinction or lawsuits, decided to open the doors. They invited officials, journalists, even skeptical scientists to tour the temples, and what they saw was undeniable, not a cult's handiwork, but a massive artistic and spiritual effort in hiding their vision. Damon Herr had created a wonder, and now the world wanted in. Once the cosmic cat was out of the bag, there was no turning back, facing imminent destruction. The demonic community made a bold choice: total transparency. Instead of denying or hiding their creation, they invited the world inside, a calculated risk. But it paid off big. Journalists, archaeologists, engineers, and even skeptical government officials were escorted down the mountain to see what had been carved beneath their feet. And what they found was less of a cult hideout and more of a hidden meeting point where Vatican secrets met Gordy's subconscious. There was a mirror hall, a huge room with glass walls, stained glass ceilings, and tiled floors reflecting light like an energy kaleidoscope. There was a hall shaped like a chalice, dedicated to feminine principles and ancient earth goddesses. Each temple was designed precisely, not just artistically, but energetically, matching what the Demonians believed were synchronicity lines, cosmic energy pathways running through the earth. The architecture was built to resonate with these lines, amplifying their effect and turning the space into a kind of. And what they found was less secret cult hideout and more Vatican meets the subconscious of Gordy. There's a mirror hall, a huge room with glass walls, a stained glass ceiling, and a tile floor that reflects light, like an energy kaleidoscope. There's a hall shaped like a holy grail dedicated to the feminine principle and ancient earth goddesses. Every temple was designed precisely not just artistically, but energetically to line up with what the Damon Huron folks believe are synchronicity lines, cosmic energy paths crisscrossing Earth. The architecture was built to resonate with these lines, amplifying their effects and turning the space into a kind of spiritual engine. The Italian authorities, now under public and media pressure, faced a tough problem. Technically, these temples were illegal, but destroying them meant wrecking a modern art wonder that caught people's imaginations. In a rare act of mercy from the bureaucrats, instead of shutting the complex down, they let Damon Huron keep ownership under strict safety and preservation rules. Engineers checked the structure's integrity. Historians cataloged the symbols. The artist just stood there, mouth agape. By the mid-90s, the temples of humanity had morphed from a forbidden mystery into a cultural sensation. The crew started offering guided tours and meditation retreats. Filmmakers and photographers couldn't get enough of the halls. Of course, critics still grumbled. But curiosity drowned out the condemnation. What was once hidden was now an open secret to the world, and in a strange twist, the very secrecy that once protected the temples became their biggest marketing tool. People weren't just coming to see the art. They came to witness a miracle that, spoiler alert, was totally made up. The mountain still keeps its secrets. Now it just whispers them to anyone who'll listen. To the untrained eye, the temples might look like a chaotic art project gone wild. Every color, symbol, and cosmic light thrown in for good measure. But to Damon Huron's, every inch has a purpose. This isn't just a sacred space. It's a consciousness machine, a metaphysical tool designed to amp up spiritual energy, awaken human potential, and sync humanity with the universe. At the core of Damon Huron philosophy is the belief that Earth is stitched together by synchronicity lines. Energy flows kinda like longitude lines or acupuncture meridians. They claim these lines connect major spots around the planet pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, and now the underground temples at Vidraco. The temples weren't just tossed in randomly. They're deliberately built at the crossroads of these lines, turning them into some kind of interdimensional charging stations, at least in Damon Huron logic. Each room reflects a different spiritual concept. For example, the water hall is dedicated to past lives and emotional healing. The orb hall is considered the temple's energy hub, a place to chat with higher intelligences and distant civilizations. No, not metaphorically. Damon Hurons genuinely believe consciousness exists beyond Earth, and the temples act like beacons. It's not just symbolism. The community mixes sound, geometry, and material resonance into the architecture to activate these energies. Walls lined with copper coils, quartz crystals positioned to bounce frequencies. Everything from colors to symbols and materials is chosen based on how well it resonates with human consciousness and planetary harmony. Visitors often report weird experiences, feeling energy waves, hearing unexplainable sounds, or slipping into altered states of awareness. Placebo or ley lines, The temples seem to work. Even skeptical scientists have noted unusually strong electromagnetic activity in some rooms. But for Damon Huron devotees, science just confirms what they already know. This is a living temple, interacting with intention, emotion, and thought. It's not just a bridge between Earth and the stars, but a bridge between who we are now and who we could become. To them, the temples of humanity aren't relics of the past, but prototypes for the future, while the underground temples are Damon Huron's most visually stunning feat. They're just one piece of a much bigger spiritual experiment above ground. The Damon Federation operates like a kind of tiny intentional nation with a constitution, currency, schools, and even its own way of telling time. Yep, they use their own calendar. Starting from 1975, the year the Federation was born in Damon Huron reckoning. We're currently in year 50. The community is organized into eco-villages, each with a special focus: farming, art, research, healing, or temple work. Daily life blends mysticism and mundanity. People grow their own food, meditate in groups, and meet up in weekly social study sessions were all about tweaking your spiritual progress, syncing it up with the group's collective evolution. At its peak, Damhur boasted over 1,000 members from more than 30 countries. Newcomers didn't just drop in casually. They went through initiation and were encouraged to live as part of the community, giving up some personal stuff and pitching in their skills for the collective. Careers ranged from sculptors to software developers. Everyone was expected to chip in. Education played a huge role in Damhurian life. Kids didn't just learn math and languages, they studied sacred geometry, ancient myths, and energy awareness. Heck, there was even a Damhur University offering courses in esoteric science, spiritual physics, and alternative healing. If that sounds like Hogwarts with solar panels, you're not wrong. The philosophy behind all this was basically the idea that the divine exists in everything, and humanity's purpose is to wake up as co-creators with the universe. That means living in harmony with nature, exploring consciousness, and using creativity as a spiritual tool. To outsiders, the community looked kinda quirky, even cult-like, but there was no single god, no rigid doctrine, and no charismatic tyrant. Leadership was democratic and roles rotated. Members were free to leave, and many did. Critics from former members cited internal pressure, ideological rigidity, or burnout, but even critics admitted it was like nothing else on Earth. Damhur wasn't just a commune or a meditation retreat. It was an ongoing social experiment where people tried to seriously live a myth, not just write about it. Walking through the temples of humanity was stepping into a universe made of symbols. Every wall, ceiling, and floor hid layers of meaning, myth, math, and cosmos. But Dahmer didn't see art as just decoration. Here, art was sacred tech, a spiritual wake-up tool, unlocking ancient memory and chatting with the divine without saying a word. Their aesthetic wasn't random. It mashed up Egyptian symbols, Celtic spirals, Hindu gods, and star maps of the future. One chamber might show Horus's eye, while another had stylized DNA strands or planetary alignments. These weren't just pretty patterns, these were deliberate codes. Damhurians believed these symbols spoke the language of the soul, bypassing logic and triggering deeper awareness. But why mix so many cultures and traditions? Their teaching said every myth was a piece of a bigger universal truth. Stories told in different languages all pointed to the same cosmic origin. The temples didn't claim to recreate any religion. Instead, they aimed to harmonize them all, not with bland blending, but a purposeful fusion of humanity's spiritual history. Then there was the language issue. Languages plural. Damhor developed its own sacred language, not exactly new, but precise. It included thousands of hieroglyphs, each designed to express spiritual concepts that regular words supposedly can't capture. You'd see these hieroglyphs carved in stone and glass all over the temples, glittering in gold leaf, etched on colored marble, hovering above doorways like glowing spells for the community. These symbols weren't invented by humans, but remembered by them. Falco claimed this language originated from ancient civilizations predating our recorded history, maybe even extraterrestrial. In other words, these symbols were less created and more recovered like spiritual fossils from a wiser, earlier era. Visitors often described the inside of the temples as deeply moving, even overwhelming. Many cried. Some said more was created and restored, like spiritual fossils from a wiser, earlier age. Visitors often describe the experience inside the temple as deeply moving, even overwhelming. Many cry. Some say they feel a strange sense of familiarity, like they're recalling something long forgotten, and that's exactly the point. The temples weren't designed to explain anything. They were designed to evoke feelings, because in Damanhur, truth isn't taught. It's awakened through stories, symbols, and the silence between words. Humanity's temples were never meant to be monuments to the past. They were and still are blueprints for the future, not just some spiritual mumbo-jumbo, but a cultural one where architecture, consciousness, and community mix into something fresh. While the world above races ahead with tech and division, the underground world of Vidraco expands slowly, deliberately, brushstroke by brushstroke. Even today, the temples aren't finished. Damhur treats them like living creatures, constantly evolving. New rooms get added, so old ones renovated, murals retouched, new symbols introduced to reflect the community's shifting energy. Unlike traditional sacred sites frozen in time, humanity's temples still breathe. They grow alongside the people who built them since their discovery. Damhur has expanded globally. Now the Federation runs centers in various countries, online courses, and attracts a flood of international visitors, whether for meditation, energy healing, or just plain curiosity. Some come expecting novelty. Many leave deeply impressed, not necessarily converted, but moved by the sheer ambition of the place. Seriously, how many communities actually build a church from scratch, underground, in secret, yet Damhur faces criticism. Skeptics doubt some claims, past lives, synchronicity, star communication. Others worry about the intensity of devotion or the level of zeal expected from members. But through it all, the Federation survives not by locking doors, but by opening gates. Today, these temples symbolize possibility. What can you create when art, intention, and community collide? They remind us that great sacred sites, from the ancient world pyramids, cathedrals, ziggurats, aren't just buildings. They're collective belief made tangible. Damhur dares to ask, why did we stop building like that? Maybe that's the real legacy of humanity's temples, not their faith, but their boldness in a world obsessed with efficiency and showmanship. A bunch of regular folks decided to dig deep, underground, and create something sacred by hand, in silence. For beauty and spirit, this isn't just a temple, it's a question carved in stone. What are you building in your life? Long before satellites orbited Earth or sailors shouted land ho, humans were already on the move, following coasts, crossing deserts, recording their ideas about the world onto clay, stone, or hide. Travel wasn't just curiosity, it was survival. The first explorers weren't explorers at all. They were gatherers, traders, hunters, refugees. But over time, movement became more than necessity. It turned into strategy and eventually legacy. The earliest maps weren't grand geographical masterpieces. They were patterns carved into cave walls, etchings on bones, or mental images passed down orally. Around 2300 BCE, the Babylonians carved one of the first known maps onto a clay tablet, not a world map, but a map of a single region marked with rivers, towns, and mountains. To them, Earth was a flat disk surrounded by cosmic oceans, with Babylon smack dab in the middle, geographically. Not exactly accurate, but it reflected something even more important intention. These folks wanted to understand their surroundings. They wanted to navigate. But how do you move without roads, signs, or star charts? You watch the sun. You study the stars. You memorize landmarks, animal migrations, wind directions, and if you're lucky, you pass that knowledge to someone with a better memory than you, like the ancient Polynesians, masters of navigation using ocean swells, bird flight paths, and star positions. Understanding the world around you, they wanted to navigate, but how do you get anywhere without roads, signs, or star maps? You watch the sun, you study the stars, you memorize the terrain, animal migrations, wind directions, and if you're lucky, you pass that knowledge on to someone with a better memory than you, like the ancient Polynesians. They mastered navigation using ocean waves, bird flight paths, and constellations. Meanwhile, merchants in Mesopotamia followed river routes like the Tigris and Euphrates, turning seasonal floods into transport highways. In these early civilizations, travel was rarely a solo gig. Community life was slow and often dangerous. Travelers faced robbers, storms, disease, and sometimes got lost forever. But they also carried goods, languages, ideas, and tech across regions. Trade routes started to look like veins running through the ancient world. Exploration didn't need to mean discovering new continents to be revolutionary. Sometimes a short trip to the next city, oasis, or fertile valley was enough. Those tiny steps built the networks that later became civilization. So when we talk about ancient exploration, we're not just talking long journeys. It's a primal urge to know what's beyond the horizon and leave footprints on unknown lands. Ancient Egyptians weren't known for globe-trotting, but when they traveled, they brought fireworks, rituals, and usually armed escorts. The Nile was their highway, not just for pleasure cruises. Pharaohs sent expeditions south to Nubia, east to Sinai, and even further to mysterious lands like Punt, a semi-mythical kingdom Egyptians called the Land of the Gods. Its exact location is still debated. Somalia, Eritrea, southern Arabia, nobody's sure. But one thing's clear, Egyptians sent ships loaded with goods and prayers there, hoping to return with frankincense, gold, rare animals, and a whiff of sacred prestige. One of the most famous recorded expeditions happened under Queen Hatshepsut, the badass female pharaoh of Egypt. Around 1478 BCE, she made the trip to Punt and proudly carved the journey into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. The carvings show massive ships, men carrying myrrh trees, and locals with exotic features and fancy headwear. This wasn't just trade. It was a mix of diplomacy, propaganda, and spiritual alliance. The Egyptians also ventured into the Sinai Peninsula not only to conquer, but to mine turquoise and copper. These expeditions often involved hundreds of workers, scribes, soldiers, and priests. Travel was state-funded and thoroughly documented. Pharaohs didn't send explorers out on credit. They deployed logistics machines. Officials recorded everything, what was mined, who participated, and how many offerings were made to the gods to guarantee a safe trip. Despite being surrounded by desert, Egypt wasn't isolated. Caravans crossed the western desert, linking oases and bringing goods from as far as Libya. Sea travel was risky but allowed contact with Byblos, Crete, and other ports on the eastern Mediterranean. But don't get it twisted, traveling in ancient Egypt wasn't a walk in the park, whether by land or water. Expeditions were slow, dangerous, and expensive. Still, they were seen as essential extensions of the sacred order. When Pharaoh moved, Egypt moved, and every journey reinforced their worldview that Egypt was the universe's center, and everything else, friend, foe, or foreigner, existed to be known, an essential expansion of the sacred order. When Pharaoh moved, Egypt moved, and each trip reinforced their worldview that Egypt was the center of the universe, and everything else, friend, foe, or foreigner, existed to be known, tamed, or worshipped for them. Exploring wasn't rebellion against the gods. It was serving them. If ancient Egypt looked inward toward the river and gods, the Phoenicians looked out to sea, building ships to chase the horizon. They popped up around 1500 BC from coastal cities like Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon in today's Lebanon. The Phoenicians didn't conquer land, they conquered water, and that's how they became the boldest sailors and traders of the ancient world, not an empire in the usual sense. No massive armies, no towering ziggurat temples, but they built something arguably cooler, a network. The Phoenicians set up trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean, from the Levant to North Africa to Cyprus, Sicily, Spain, and even to the mysterious edge of the Atlantic at the Strait of Gibraltar. Along the way, they founded cities, the most famous being Carthage, which later became Rome's rival. So, what made them successful boats? Slim, fast, and tough, Phoenician ships were the marvels of their day. They combined sails with tall hulls for protection, plus curved designs that sliced through waves. These weren't just cargo ships, they were floating markets piled high with cedar wood, glass, fabrics dyed in famous purple, and carved alphabets, traded like high-tech gadgets. Yep, the Phoenicians also gave us one of humanity's greatest connectors, the alphabet. Their writing simplified scripts, moving from cuneiform and hieroglyphics to a system of just 22 characters. It influenced Greek, Latin, and eventually our modern alphabet. But the Phoenician journey wasn't without risks. Pirates prowled the waters. Storms could smash ships to bits, and every new port brought the risk of local hostility or economic competition. Still, they persisted not as conquerors, but connectors. They carried tin from England, silver from Iberia, papyrus from Egypt, and spices from Arabia. Some sources, including Herodotus, even claim Phoenician sailors under Egyptian sponsorship circumnavigated Africa in the early 6th century BC. Bold claim, but if anyone in the ancient world could pull off such a stunt, it was the Phoenicians. Egyptian sponsorship circled Africa in the early 6th century BC. Bold claim. But if anyone in the ancient world could pull off a stunt like that, it was probably the Phoenicians. They didn't build monuments. Instead, they rooted themselves and mapped the ancient world's center through wind, waves, and trade. Meanwhile, Mediterranean sailors crossed waves trading from city to far-flung city in the east. Another journey was happening, slower, dustier, but just as transformative. In ancient China, travel didn't mean sailing the seas. It meant caravans crossing deserts, winding through mountains, and facing some of the harshest terrains on Earth. This was the birth of what we now call the Silk Road, a massive web of land routes linking East Asia with the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually Europe. It all kicked off around the 2nd century BCE during the Han Dynasty, when Emperor Wu sent an envoy named Zhang Qian west to form an alliance against nomadic invaders. Zhang Qian failed his political mission spectacularly, but in the process, he accidentally stumbled upon entire civilizations beyond China's western borders. Years later, he returned with tales of Persian goods, Central Asian horses, and strange cultures. The emperor wasn't thrilled about the delay, but he got hooked on the possibilities. Trade routes boomed. Chinese merchants started exporting silk, lacquerware, spices, jade, and porcelain. These goodies were so coveted, they became status symbols from India all the way to Rome. In return, caravans brought back horses, glassware, wool, and gold. But it wasn't just stuff that traveled. Ideas, tech, and religions crossed borders too. Buddhism made its way from India into China. Art styles merged. Musical instruments got swapped around. Even paper, invented in China, eventually showed up in the West, sparking a revolution in written communication. But the Silk Road journey was brutal. Caravans crossed the Taklamakan Desert, nicknamed the place where nobody comes back. Sandstorms could bury travelers alive. Bandits lurked in the shadows, and the thousands of miles from Chang'an, today's Xi'an, to cities like Samarkand or Antioch could take months or even years. Travelers depended on oases where tiny trading towns thrived like green gems in the desert Dunhuang, Kashgar, and so on. No empire controlled the entire route. It was kept alive by a patchwork of kingdoms, tribes, and city-states, each guarding a stretch and taxing what passed through. Yet, despite the chaos, it worked, creating a network that reshaped the ancient world. The Silk Road wasn't just one path. It was a circulatory system pumping life, faith, and ambition across continents, while deserts, rivers, and seas were huge hurdles for ancient travelers. The Persian Empire took a different route. They built long, durable, and well-maintained roads, not just for armies or goods. For the Achaemenid Persians, roads were the empire's backbone, a way to tie conquered lands, languages, and cultures into one big, messy family. The crown jewel was the royal road, constructed by Darius the Great in the 5th century BCE, stretching over 1,500 miles from Susa in Persia to Sardis near the Aegean Sea. This superhighway connected the empire east to west, letting couriers, merchants, and military officers travel huge distances at unheard-of speeds, thanks to relay stations stocked with fresh horses and supplies. The royal messengers could cover the whole road in just 7 to 9 days. Pretty impressive for the time. To put that in perspective, an average traveler or caravan would take about 3 months. But this road wasn't just fast, it was safe. Patrols, forts, and outposts kept travelers protected along the king's route. Visitors from across the empire, Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, used the royal road not just to move goods, but to spread ideas, gossip, and politics. In many ways, it became the empire's information superhighway. The Persian road network stretched beyond the royal road, linking cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and Babylon, reaching all the way to Egypt, India, and Central Asia. Caravanserais, following the king, travelers from across the empire, from Babylonian scribes to Greek diplomats, all used the royal road not just to move goods, but to spread ideas, rumors, and politics. In many ways, it became the empire's information superhighway. Persia's road system stretched beyond the royal road, linking cities like Ecbatana, Persepolis, and caravan stations popped up to offer rest and supplies to tired merchants and travelers. These spots later became crucial parts of the Silk Road and Islamic trade routes for centuries, not just infrastructure. Persian roads symbolize the empire's desire to unify its lands, not just by force, but through connection, by standardizing coins, weights, and official languages. The Persians made it easier for everyone to interact, trade, and plug into the imperial economy. In a world where most movement was slow and chaotic, Persia brought something revolutionary: order, structure, and a system designed for long-distance travel. In short, the Persians didn't just rule an empire, they engineered it. The Greeks weren't empire builders in the usual sense, at least, not at first, but their nature was pretty bizarre, from Herodotus to Pythias. Greek travelers roamed the ancient world hunting knowledge, trade, asking questions, collecting stories, and mapping the unknown. One of the earliest and coolest explorers was Pythias of Massalia, now Marseille, around 325 BC, who sailed beyond the known world past the Strait of Gibraltar to the Atlantic coast and supposedly reached a mysterious northern land he called Thule. Scholars think he might have made it to Iceland or Norway. He described wild stuff like the midnight sun and frozen seas, things Mediterranean readers thought were pure fantasy. But Pythias wasn't a myth maker. He was a scientist with a sailor's heart. Meanwhile, over in the eastern Mediterranean, Greek merchants and philosophers traveled through Egypt, Persia, and India. Alexander the Great's 4th century BC campaigns blew open the Greek world, kicking off the Hellenistic era, where Greek became the common language from Athens to Bactria. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Seleucia turned into crossroads for goods and ideas. Traveling wasn't just for the adventurous anymore. It was expected. Then came the Romans, the empire's engineers. The Romans really took travel to the next level, literally paving the way. With their famous road system, they connected cities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East at their peak. The Roman Empire boasted over 250,000 kilometers of roads, including more than 50,000 kilometers of paved highways. Roads like the Via Appia, built in 312 BC, were engineering marvels, designed to last forever. Many of these roads still exist today. Roman roads were originally military tools, letting legions move fast to crush rebellions. But they also boosted trade, mail delivery, pilgrimages, and even tourism. Wealthy Romans visited Greek temples, Egyptian pyramids, and resort towns in Gaul. Travel guides and tourist tales became popular reads. For Romans, travel wasn't just practical, it was a statement. Roads proved the empire's reach. If a road led to your town, congrats, you mattered. And with every mile built, Rome reshaped how the ancient world felt about distance and connection. Meanwhile, while land routes like the Silk Road carried caravans through deserts and mountains, another vast, ancient network sprawled across the Indian Ocean. This was the Maritime Silk Road, linking ports from East Africa to India, from the Arabian Peninsula to Southeast Asia long before the age of sails. Sailors had to ride the monsoons, crossing huge distances and turning the ocean into a global marketplace. The secret monsoon winds seasonal, predictable, and flipping direction twice a year, ancient. Sailors learned to time their journeys with the winds, heading east when winds blew in from Africa, and west when they flipped. With this knowledge, ships could reliably cross oceans, making trips that once seemed impossible. Indian traders sailed from Gujarat and Tamil coasts, exporting spices, textiles, gems, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Spices, textiles, gems, and ivory. In return, they imported horses, incense, gold, and even exotic animals. Arab merchants from ports like Aden and Oman moved goods in and out of the Persian Gulf, while East African traders in places like Kilwa dealt in ivory and tortoise shells. Chinese ships, especially during the Han Dynasty, and then came the Tang Dynasty, jumping on the bandwagon by exporting silk, ceramics, and lacquerware. By the 1st century AD, Greek and Roman ships were docking at Indian ports like Barug and Muziris, totally giving the land routes the cold shoulder. A Roman-era guidebook, The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, gave a play-by-play of bustling trade ports, goods exchanged, and the routes sailors took across the Indian Ocean. This wasn't just guesswork. It was basically the ancient GPS for global trade. But the ocean wasn't just about goods. It was also a highway for ideas. Buddhism spread from India to Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia through these sea routes. Later, Muslim traders carried their faith across the Indian Ocean, shaping coastal cultures in East Africa and the Malay world, unlike land-based military empires. The Indian Ocean trade network thrived on diversity and cooperation. Ports became melting pots of languages, religions, and cuisines. A Tamil merchant, a Swahili sailor, a Yemeni cleric, and a Chinese diplomat could all strike deals at the same dock. In these ancient waters, the tides didn't just bring ships, they brought civilization. Not every ancient trip was about trade, war, or empire for millions. The biggest reason to travel was faith. Sacred sites, holy rivers, and distant temples pulled pilgrims from across continents, often paying a steep price, seeking healing, enlightenment, or divine blessings. This wasn't your average vacation. These were spiritual challenges, ongoing acts of devotion. In ancient India, pilgrimage was central to Hindu and Buddhist life. People traveled to bathe in the holy Ganges, visit temples like Varanasi or Bodh Gaya, or climb the Himalayas hunting for mountain hermitages. These journeys, often long and dangerous, were believed to wash away bad karma and bring one closer to liberation. Buddhist monks didn't just travel within India. They spread their faith along trade routes to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, China, and beyond. In Greece, pilgrims flocked to oracles like Delphi, where Apollo's priestess spouted riddles supposedly revealing divine insight. Others visited healing sanctuaries like Epidaurus, performing rituals and offerings in the hope of a cure. These sacred pilgrimages also doubled as social and economic events with vendors, entertainers, and civic ceremonies turning pilgrimages into community festivals. In the Roman Empire, religion was tied to state identity. Pilgrimages to royal temples and worship centers were acts of faith and political loyalty. Devotees might visit the temple of Asclepius for healing, or walk all the way to Jerusalem, then under Roman control, as part of Jewish religious tradition, especially during festivals like Passover. Pilgrimage was also key in Zoroastrian and Egyptian traditions. Ancient Persians traveled to fire temples, while Egyptians made sacred trips along the Nile to partake in temple festivals like those at Abydos, believed to be Osiris's burial site. These holy journeys often blurred the lines between spiritual and political space. Roads were maintained not just for armies or merchants, but also for the faithful. Temples popped up along trade routes and doubled as resting spots for pilgrims. As a result, pilgrimages helped bind vast regions with shared beliefs and sacred geography. Ultimately, these trips were more than physical travel. Traveling in devotion symbolized leaving behind ego, comfort, and attachments, returning transformed. The body moved across land, but the soul journeyed way deeper. As the ancient world gave way to the Middle Ages, the foundation of global connection was laid not just by emperors, but by countless travelers bravely stepping into the unknown. Merchants, pilgrims, explorers, and scholars together wove a vast network on land and sea, creating a weird, wonderful web of connection, sacred and commercial, peaceful and dangerous. What they left behind wasn't just footprints, but a legacy of traded goods, ideas, beliefs, and tech that shaped civilization for centuries. Travel changed everything. The spread of writing systems, like the Phoenician alphabet, helped standardize communication across borders. Religious movements, Buddhism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam went global thanks to the steady steps of wandering teachers and believers. Spices from India spiced up Roman feasts. Chinese silk graced the wardrobes of Parthian kings. African gold crossed the Red Sea to Persian treasuries. But travel also rewired how people thought about the world. Ancient geographers like Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with jaw-dropping accuracy using just the sun's angle and some logic. Strabo and Ptolemy mapped continents using second-hand reports and bold guesses. Even their flawed maps were stepping stones towards something bigger, a vision of a connected Earth where strangers weren't myths but fellow travelers on different roads. These roads, rivers, and sea routes would grow into the sprawling trade networks of medieval and early modern times. The Silk Road merged into Islamic caravan routes. Roman roads were trod by Christian pilgrims. Indian Ocean navigation knowledge passed from Arab sailors to the Chinese, and later Europeans. Maybe the coolest part, that ancient spirit of travel, the itch to explore beyond what's known, still lives on. The modern world runs on engines and GPS, sure, but its heart still beats with the same curiosity that pushed Phoenician sailors and Chinese caravans forward, and Egyptian messengers thousands of years ago. No passports, no credit cards, no travel insurance, but maritime knowledge in the Indian Ocean got passed down to Arab, Chinese, and later European sailors. Probably the coolest thing here is the old school spirit of exploration that itch to go beyond what you know's still alive and kicking. The modern world might run on engines and GPS, but its heart still beats with the same curiosity that drove Phoenician sailors, Chinese caravans, and Egyptian messengers thousands of years ago. No passports, credit cards, or travel insurance back then. But they had guts, vision, and rock-solid belief that the world beyond mountains, sand dunes, or ocean waves mattered. What's out of sight was worth the risk, and they believed we inherit a world connected not just by trade or conquest, but by the movement of people fade out